It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulsen and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
Take Command podcast from Audacy Sports. What's up? What's happening? I'm Craig Hoffman. That is Logan Paulsen. Logan, we got a good one today. Ross Tucker is going to join us in just a little bit. The national analyst for Westwood One and a couple of other outlets will join us. Also, former Washington football player, Washington alumnus. Let's see if we can get some good stories out of him. He's here during the Spurrier era, so there's no telling.
Some great story. Yeah,
there's no telling what Ross has in the bag. But we actually want to start today recapping the Playcallers, the series that Jordan Rodriguez did that we talked to her about last week. But as much as we did in that conversation with Jordan, there's so much more left from it. I obviously covered Sean McVay for multiple years, his final years here in Washington. Logan played for Sean and Kyle and Mike and Matt when they were all here for 2012, and obviously played for Kyle again in other places. So there's just so much to talk about, Logan, because I think in so many ways that series gets to the essence of coaching, but then there's obviously specific elements about those four men, and specifically Kyle and Sean as coaches, that shows you both what separates them and what makes them great, but also the flaws that at times have held them back.
Yeah, and I also think we can talk a little bit about that 2012 season. You know, I think that was something that people, like in the comments on the video, wanted to hear more about, and just kind of like my recollection of it. So I guess we could start with that.
Yeah, let's start there if you're willing to. I mean, I thought that was very beautifully put by Jordan when we talked to her about how it's like within the context of football, there's an element of tragedy there, and I can hear in your voice talking about it. But if you're willing to go there, let's go.
Yeah, it's not like I'm not going to go crazy. It's more schematic. I'm not going to talk about the personal stuff quite as much, but schematically, you know. And I think that offense really shows you kind of it was like a spark point, you know. And what I mean by that is like we were doing stuff at the time that no one had ever done, and we had taken this kind of West Coast principle of creating horizontal space and putting defenses in conflict to like the next level. And like that's all Sean and Kyle and Mike and all these different guys, right, working together and being competitive, like Jordan pointed out. And so one of the things I wanted to just kind of call attention to is like the simplicity, like how they were totally able to regulate defenses. You know, they were able to kind of almost ensure with Robert's running ability that they were going to cover three every single time. And cover three is a defense that, you know, it's interesting kind of like to see this come full circle. Like later in the series, she talked about Vic Fangio, like with this match concept, and basically cover three match or zone match comes about because of the holes in cover three. You know what I mean? Like that we were able to exploit as a team in 2012. And so basically like one of the things about that season that I remember very vividly is like, I thought, man, like defenses in the NFL aren't that complicated because like they were just so simplified. Right. And then I think, you know, it's like this constant cat and mouse, like either you're evolving or you're dying. And I think like in that off season from 2012 to 2013, like we just couldn't evolve that system quickly enough, or they couldn't evolve it. And that's not an indictment of them because there were some other like mitigating factors, you know, Robert's desire to be a pocket passer, all those different things, which I think are fairly well documented and fairly well discussed. But, you know, like defenses were like, well, this is how we're going to stop it. And then we didn't have like an answer, you know. And I think when Jordan was talking about, you know, kind of the evolution of Kyle and making sure you have answers. Like I remember having conversation with him, vivid conversations where, you know, Robert would get up and say he wanted to put in a play, and he'd get up in front of the team and start talking through it. And Kyle would just kind of like, you know, he would do this in front of everybody. He'd be like, hey, you know, what happens if it's cover four? And Robert would be like, oh, you do this. And it's like, what happens if you get, you know, Sam Strunk safety? And Robert was like, well, we got to slide the protection. He was like, how are you going to see it? And it was like this really interesting process for him. And I just felt like because of some of the restrictions placed on Kyle by Robert, that evolution couldn't continue with that offense, which is kind of a sad thing. And so thinking back on that and then seeing where Kyle's offense is at now and how, I don't want to say there's an answer all the time, but just how intricate his game plans are, right? Same thing with Sean. They're so intricate. They're so layered. And I feel like it all goes back to that 2012 season and kind of that fall on your face element going into 2013, which there's a multitude of reasons for that. But again, it's something that I don't want to talk too much about.
Well, let me ask you this from a purely I'm asking from a football perspective. There's obviously the personal side of it's been reported Robert didn't want to run anymore, and there's all the
Yeah.
back and forth between Kyle, Robert, Dan, whatever. But
Yeah.
from a football standpoint, if Robert had been, and there's an injury also to consider
Yeah.
here,
Yeah.
but
Which is so super important to account for also.
right. So, but let's pretend Robert finishes. You guys just lose to Seattle, not Robert gets hurt, right?
Yeah.
So he comes back, he's healthy. 2013, the scheme is what it was, but you have a healthy Robert Griffin going into 2013, who's
Yeah.
willing to run
Yeah.
for whatever reasons he wasn't willing to or couldn't or whatever. Put those aside, but he's the same guy he was as a rookie when he's cooking.
Yeah.
What does that team look like?
So I think you still run into some of the same hurdles, but what I do think you do see is I think you see some more innovation. And I think about, my time in Houston in 2019 when they had Deshaun Watson and they were running that, we'd watch Washington film when I was in Houston, of how they ran the zone read. And the thing that they did is kind of what Philly does now. It's a zone read with a RPO. So I think in the story, one of the things we talked about, and again, if Robert's healthy, this isn't quite as big of an issue, right? Because I think he's more willing to do some of this stuff. So we used to do this thing where the tight end would line up to the left off the ball, and Robert's reading the defensive end to the right with him and Alfred, right? If the defensive end pinches, then Robert pulls it. And so teams started, doing a scrape. So they'd pinch the defensive end and scrape the linebacker over the top. I, as the Grizz blocker, would run and block that scrape player. And so basically we had
So
a
you
hat
would come across the formation
and block that guy. Correct.
Yeah.
100%. And so basically, because of Robert's kind of demand of saying, I don't want to run the ball the same way, in these ways, he had a very specific vision of how he wanted to be used. From what I understand, I would try to get to the linebacker's outside number, and the linebacker would just run to the sideline. So old Robert, or Robert from 2012, would just put his foot in the ground and cut up for a gain of 15 yards, right? Because the offensive line could block that backside backer. Now, I think Kyle, if he had been with Robert more, would say, well, shoot, if that's how they're going to play it, we can line up in 11 personnel in a 2x2 with the tight end to the left. We get to that overload going to the right, and then just have the slot receiver, who's Santana Moss, run like a drift or a slant to replace that scraping linebacker. And then off this RPO, we can find that hole. So I kind of felt like that was going to be the next iteration of this offense. That was the next logical step, which is one of the reasons why Philly is so efficient right now, is because they have the zone read, they have the Grizz blocker, but they've kind of said we can get one step further and put the defense in conflict one more time, and with this pass element that they have off of it. So that's kind of where I think the offense would have gone. I don't think it could have happened more gradually. I think because Robert would have been more willing to run, I think the offense would have been much more effective for longer. It wouldn't have been as effective as it was in 2012. But I think that's something that I always think back on. There's this kind of confluence of Robert being hurt, right? And he wasn't quite as fast as he was before. He wasn't quite as willing as he was before. That led to a decrease in offensive efficiency. And that decrease in offensive efficiency, coupled with kind of some other relationships, made it super hard to innovate. Kind of stagnated that process, which Jordan talked about so much, at least in my perspective. I mean, I don't have all the details, but just from a 1,000-foot view. So that's kind of what I would say. I think that team could have been in a much better spot. Obviously, if Robert's healthy, Robert had been slightly more willing. And that's not an indictment of Robert. I don't want people to think that I'm mad at Robert for that. I get it. He thought he was doing what was best for him in his career at the time. And he was young. He's a young player. So that's a hard thing to kind of negotiate. But I think it just kind of stymied that innovative process, and it led to an offense that was very, very stagnant, And this is a story. This is a quick anecdotal story. So we were playing the Kansas City Chiefs. We were getting absolutely murdered. It was in that snow game in 13.
Yep.
I think they had a couple of returns for almost touchdowns, and it was just
they did.
Terrible.
There's one where it's actually one of my favorite Trent Williams stories. Robert threw one, and Robert and Trent ran the guy down on the sideline together at the same speed.
Yes.
And Robert is an Olympic standard hurdler at the 100 meters. So he's faster than hell. And Trent is running stride for stride with him in the snow because he's Trent Williams and he's from outer space.
Yes, 100%. But in that, I think I might have told this story before, but in that game, we ran this concept in 2 minute called Lion. So Lion is basically just two slants in Kyle's offense. It's probably called something different now, right? and they were running some type of quarters. So quarters coverage, right? Think about it in your Madden vision. Like you got a piece of pie, you divide it into 4 pieces. And
Yep.
one of the reasons line is effective is because you got this hook player who has to push through to the far slant or take the inside slant. So basically line is double slants. And so we were in a 2-minute drive, and Kyle called Lion, I want to say 3 to 5 times consecutively in a row. And Robert's in the huddle, like kind of pissy, upset, like all grumpy or whatever. And, all the guys are kind of like, what's going on? Da, 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 da. And then, like, I kind of was like, Kyle, like, guys were upset about that. And Kyle's like, Logan, let me show you something real quick. So we went into his office, or it might have been in the team room. I don't remember exactly where it was. And he puts on the tape. He says, Logan, look at what coverage is Lion good for? I'm like, it's good versus quarters. He's like, watch this throw. So basically the first slant Robert throw is like 5 feet over the receiver's head. We call it again. It's in the dirt. So now it's 3rd and 10. And finally he hits the slant and it's a 15-yard gain. So I was like, they did not change their coverage. So this was there the whole time. Like Robert just needed to hit it. And like this was kind of like where I first noticed the friction between the two of them. Like, because it was like Robert wanted to be a pocket passer. And Kyle, I think, knew, because he's smart, that Robert wasn't quite ready for it yet. And that was the first time I was like, oh, like there's something going on here. And that was something that characterized the season. You got somebody who wanted to go this way, someone knew who they weren't ready to go that way, and it was like this constant battle between those two personalities that was that I only kind of tangentially saw, but I'm sure, like talking to a couple other people, that behind closed doors that was a little bit more problematic, I guess.
Yeah. I don't know if you want to answer this question, but I'm going to ask it. And if you're like, I don't know, then you can say I don't know. But do you think a different coach could have finessed that better? Or even like, let's say Kyle now, an
Yeah.
older, more mature, more experienced Kyle, who probably has some of that experience because he dealt what he dealt with Robert. But you have a young, trying to prove himself, still hard-headed Kyle Shanahan, and a young, overly empowered, thanks to his stardom and the ownership situation and everything, Robert Griffin III. And I do wonder if, and obviously, like, look, let's not let Mike off the hook here either.
Yeah.
Like, Mike obviously had a role to play there and didn't go exactly great.
Right.
We know that based off history. But, like, do you think that different personalities could have dealt with that differently and smooth that over and convince Robert to do that? Or was Robert just kind of in a, this is what I think, I'm doing this to protect myself because I got hurt last year doing it the other way, and there was no convincing him?
That's the $1 million question, man. Like that's an excellent question. And I think that's a question that's better served for Robert and Kyle and Mike. Cause I don't want to speak for them, but I would say having played for Kyle when I was in San Francisco, he has matured a lot. But like we had Matt Ryan on here, and Matt Ryan said one of the things that was a friction point for them was that Kyle was so singular in terms of vision for the game plan and for the offense. And that's one of the things that makes Kyle excellent. I also think, Kyle alluded to this in the podcast, in Jordan's podcast, that, ownership was not supporting the head coach there. Right. And they had supported, purportedly Robert or whatever. And I think that also led to some friction there too. Right. So I don't know if it would ever, even if Kyle today could handle it. Because I also think about Jay. I think about Sean and their relationship with Robert. And Sean is one of the most effective coaches at speaking and communicating to players. And
Yes.
Jay is a player's coach 1000%. So he's trying to get things done. He's trying to make things happen for the player. And if that staff, granted, Sean was pretty young then still too.
Sean was young. I don't know. Like, Jay is a player's coach, but I don't think Jay was always the most flexible.
But that's the thing. I'm glad you used that word flexible. It's because really smart football people are not overly flexible, especially when someone's telling them what to do. And that's the vibe that I got when Jay was here. It was like Jay's here to fix Robert or, make Robert go.
Well, yeah,
right?
That was definitely the assignment.
Right. And then it became obvious that Kirk gave you a better chance of winning, And I think that is something that is really hard to negotiate. When you are the head coach, it's your team. You want to make decisions. And that's what you've been brought in here for, is for your football expertise. And somebody is making that very, very challenging to do. And so I think that, to me, that is more, like just in talking with Jay about other stuff, like just the frustration they had, the frustration Kyle had. Like, I don't know, man. I don't know. And it's not because of Robert necessarily. It's because of, I think more, if I was going to have to kind of assign blame, it's more because of how the empowerment structure went there. It basically allowed him to kind of be like, I'm 22. I think this, and we're going to do it this way. And everybody in the building has, way more football experience than you, if that makes sense. And again, that's a really good question for those guys specifically, but that's just me kind of, observe, like kind of based on information that I know, observing that situation.
It's something that I would like to ask Robert, frankly, too, of like, hey man, you're 30, whatever you are now. Like, if you could go back, and I'm sure Robert would do some things differently, but like, is that one of them? Would you have just listened more? But it's hard. It was complicated. There's a lot of people that did a lot of stuff wrong. But so back to kind of the schematic arc though.
Sure.
You mentioned Kirk. Where did this desire to build an offense around Robert and like utilize his skills and leverage, which is smart, right? Like, you build this thing that works so well, but where does that leave you when he does get hurt and you now have Kirk Cousins in there, a very different type of player? Like, how did the scheme translate? And ultimately, like, how does that lead to the evolution of where Sean takes it, first in Washington, then with Jared Goff, and then ultimately to the Super Bowl and a championship with Matthew Stafford?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I remember talking to Grant Paulson in the locker room in 2012 and him being like, hey, can Kirk get it done? And, at the time I was like, we're really hoping that Robert's healthy and ready to go. And I think the whole team felt that way because we didn't know really how special Kirk could be. And I say special because, Kirk, was not a high draft pick. I think he was a 3rd round pick and, developed and learned and grew and understood the offense. And so, like, in terms of schematically what's going on, I think the bones of the offense remain largely unchanged. Like, obviously, like, the play actions shifted to kind of what Robert was good at and the runs he was good at, but like, we still had outside zone play action, we still had inside zone play action, we still had keepers and quick game and all the formational nuance that Kyle wanted. But in terms of when Robert was in, it was like this bunch of plays and kind of was a little bit different stylistically, a little bit more chunk play oriented, a little less kind of multi reads. It was like, let's use that big arm, that javelin arm, and get that ball where it needs to go fast and let our playmakers make plays. Right. And Kirk, is a little bit more refined at that point in their careers as like a pocket passer. And, there's a reason Robert won Rookie of the Year. It's because he's a dynamic playmaker, but Kirk it's like kind of what we talk about when we talk about quarterback evaluation for the draft all the time, Craig. Like, obviously there's the height, weight, speed measurement of a guy like Richardson, from Florida, but there's also the intellectual processing and the learning and the study and the ability to grind film and grind the playbook, that like a Bryce Young has that other people in the class don't have, as evidenced by his S2 cognition score. And I felt like you had two players that were kind of very different in terms of skill set on the roster at the same time, and they both could execute the offense, their version of the offense, in their way at a high level. So I think when Robert got hurt in Seattle, I think that was tough because we'd game planned with Robert playing in mind. So Kirk kind of came in the playbook's a little bit different because Kirk's in there now. You know what I mean? And Kirk did a great job, in my estimation, but I think that was always kind of a challenge. You were running.
It's also, that's Legion of Boom Seattle. Like,
and they were so good, man. I went back and watched a little bit of film of them the other day, like just how good Earl Thomas was. Like, people tried to run that cover 3 defense for a long time, and I think that's going to be really interesting when we talk about Vic Fangio, later, and how everyone tried to take that Seattle 3 and everywhere they went, but they couldn't do it because they didn't have Earl Thomas. And Earl Thomas's ability to cover like literally 48 yards of grass, like horizontally in the middle of the field, and basically man up those outside guys in that cover 3 vertical structure, like, is incredible. Like watching him, I just was like, man, he was so good at this, and that's why the defense works so well. Right. In my opinion. Again, I'm sure you talk to different people, and like, it's multifactorial. Defensive line was really good.
Defensive line was good. Their corners were good. Bobby Wagner's playing middle linebacker.
Yes.
He's going to the Hall of Fame. But like, Earl Thomas was the piece that, and like Cam Chancellor coming down, like, you didn't want to throw the ball over the middle because he was going to murder your receivers. But like, you could not get the chunk plays that you need to score because Earl Thomas didn't let you.
And think about that. You have probably 3 Hall of Famers in the back end. I mean, Richard Sherman, right? Would you? I don't know. Maybe like he's
Sherman,
like a
yes.
Pro Bowl caliber player.
Yeah, he
Cam, I
was a
think is.
multi-time All-Pro. You think Cam's a Hall of Famer?
I think so. I mean, so let me just say this. I think he's an archetype for that position. Maybe that's a
Yeah.
better way to put it. He is like the standard. When you're trying to build a Seattle 3, who's the guy that can be that like safety, linebacker, edge setting hybrid player? And Cam is like, look it up in the dictionary and there's Cam. Who's the post player? Oh, it's Earl Thomas. Who's the corner? It's Richard Sherman. You know, like these long, fast, really smart intellectual corners, right? And so like, to me, you had 3 guys who are the prototype for the position playing in the defense at the same time. And it's so rare to get that, I think, you know, and so I think that's one of the reasons that defense was so effective. But again, that leads to the innovation that Jordan was talking about later by guys like Vic Fangio.
Take Command podcasts from Audacy Sports. Craig Hoffman here, Logan Paulson there. Let's talk about how the defense has affected it. So we talk about how the offensive personnel and the personalities and everything on that side of the ball affects it. But ultimately, you're trying to beat specific defenses. You have that Seattle 3 that comes in, but it's really the Vic Fangio, cover 6 and all the different things that he does that puts a major halt to that offense. And at that point, Sean's in LA was the gold standard. He makes the Super Bowl, obviously that year, even after Fangio kind of puts the template out. Belichick reuses it in the Super Bowl. And they go from the best offense in the sport to start 2017 to limping-ish to the Super Bowl to struggling in a major way the following year. So first of all, if you were to define what Fangio does, not necessarily from a structure standpoint, but from a more broad, this is what he's trying to stop and this is how he's approaching it standpoint, what did he do that made it so hard for this West Coast-based play action offense to operate?
Yeah, so I mean, we could have like a 5-hour show on this. Like that's how detailed this is.
That's what Jordan just did.
Yeah, so like but even that was just an hour. Like you could probably talk about Vic Fangio and his tree. Like you could do this same show with Vic Fangio and his tree. That's how impactful it is, I think, on the league. So basically, the reason I bring up Seattle cover 3 is because in Seattle cover 3, the holes in that defense are the seams, right? So envision like receivers running up the hash. Because basically, if you run 4 verticals, you put that middle player in a bind, right? And he's got to play it's a 2-on-1. And so what teams started doing is this match principle. And so what that means is if number 2, the second receiver in the slot, goes vertical, the hook player has to match that player vertical, right? So it almost plays like man-to-man coverage, right? You get that post player in the middle. We run 4 verticals. The 2 hook players are going to carry those guys vertical. That affects the outside corners, right? Because if I'm carrying vertical, I lose any kind of hook coverage that is in that normal zone, right? So if I'm getting a dig, I now have to match it. If I'm getting a slant, I now have to match it. If I'm getting an under, I now have to match it. So that outside corner all of a sudden plays just like man as well, right? So it goes from like this very simplistic, like I went back and watched, like I said, that 2012 season because I'm doing a breakdown for Command Center. And the cover 3 structure, there is so much space at the second level of the defense behind the linebackers and in the seams, right? There is so much grass. It's like a sphere of 50 yards of grass. And so teams are like, let's get there. And then the defense's response was, shoot, how do we cover these spots up? And it ends up being this kind of match principle. And so 90% of the time in this match principle, it's going to look exactly like man. However, when you get some type of bunches and motions and short motions and crossers, they can now pass them off. And so there is this still zone cover 3 element, but it's so far bastardized, it doesn't even really look like cover 3 anymore. And that is one thing that really, really, really messed up Sean's evolution of that offense. And Jordan talked about it at her show, and I think this is brilliant by all these match teams, as we talked about it with Matt Ryan too, is it doesn't look like anything. It looks like quarters. It looks like 6. It looks like 3. It can look like cover 2, right? It can look like whatever you want it to look like, right? You can even motion, and they can zone match the motion. So it even looks even more zone-ish, and then you get in the match principles as you go. So it basically allows you to play a shapeless defense, And the whole thing Sean was doing, right, and he's well known for this, is calling the play, getting them lined up quickly, and then telling Goff where the ball needs to go. So with match, good luck, bro, because no one knows what's going on until you run routes, because we're matching route concepts, right? Two goes vertical, I match it. Two goes out, we exchange, whatever the rule is for that specific defense. And now I can't do that anymore. And I think that's where, like, that is what I thought Jordan did such a good job of in the piece, was like, Sean wanted to be innovative, and he was being innovative. He was taking all these really challenging decisions out of the quarterback's hands, which is, on this show, we've talked about that a ton. How do you limit tough decisions for the quarterback? Sean was like, let's take them all off his plate. However, when he did that, he kind of took the quarterback's ability to be a quarterback, like play football,
He
and
became a thrower.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that is something Kyle has never done. He's always played really sound offensive football and demanded that the quarterback learn and know where the ball should and has to go versus different looks. And it's like, I'm going to make a horseback riding reference here. Okay. So my wife rides horses. Okay. And when you're coming to the jump, a coach will tell you, hey, we want you to get 4 strides in to the jump. 1, 2, 3, 4, jump, right? Because we don't want to be too far away. We don't want to be too close. However, at the really high levels of jumping, you miss the distance. You don't see 4. Maybe it's 4, but it's really 5. Or you think it's 4, but it's actually 3. You need the horse to be able to overcome that and make the jump and find the distance themselves. And so I kind of feel like Sean was like, I'm always going to find the distance, always listens to me. And then all of a sudden, when he couldn't see the distance with this match coverage, it totally, Goff lost the ability to make his own decisions, kind of. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I want to take a quick step back just to explain a couple of things. No, that was great, but just to fill in a couple of gaps, right? The way Sean was able to do this, and it goes back to a quote that Andrew Whitworth gave in the piece. Andrew Whitworth said, "We wanted you to play your perfect defense because then we knew what to do." So if you play that 100%. Cover 3 and you are not matching, right? So, when that quote happens, it's when they're playing just the basic zone coverages. And it lines up like it is when you play Madden. The little bubbles go back and it's 3 deep and you got 4 underneath and you have that 50-yard sphere of grass where you know exactly where the ball needs to be. And so what Sean would do is use personnels and motions as indicators to say, okay, if I run the tight end across the formation and nobody follows, it's zone based off the pre-snap alignment and the down and distance. Hey, this is cover 3. You got your number 2 receiver on the whatever route, right? And he could see that before the snap with basic information gathering based off of personnel, alignment, etc. And because he used very similar personnel all the time, or the one year he used basically exclusively 11 personnel, he knew what defenses were going to do to him, because you have a best solution as a defense and you use it. You don't say, hey, we have 11 personnel in a tight split. We're going to play cover 2 this time, cover 3 next time, cover 4 next time. You just play cover 2 or you just play cover 3 all the time. And if the offense knows that, then they just have to attack where they know the weakness is.
Right.
Then all of a sudden, when that goes away, because those spheres of grass disappear, now you're in trouble. Now you're in that predicament where you need the quarterback to be able to read what is happening and make decisions. And that's not a skill that he's sharpened, because you've given him all the answers. And that's good offense, by the way, to give all the answers, but it does create trickle down of problems. And then I guess the question becomes, like, what did they do to fix that? And how do you then turn that on its head? And that's the constant evolution of the history of the NFL, right?
Yeah.
And that's why we go from pass heavy to run heavy, because you get super pass heavy. Teams are like, oh, defensively, we need lighter personnel. Now offenses are looking at lighter personnel, trying to throw on it because that's who they are. Then they're like, wait a second, we can run on this. They go back to run. Defenses thicken up again. And it's this cyclical nature of personnel, but also of schematics.
Well, I think that's a great point. And like Jordan hit this right on the head. Like, that's why you bring in Matt Stafford, right? A guy that, he, like, basically when he was the quarterback, all the play action stuff that had kind of characterized this scheme disappears a little bit. It's not as important. And one of the reasons they do that is because they said, Matt, we want him to see the defense and see the throws and have time to evaluate, right? So they get like these super wide splits. They really force the defense even more under more pressure because they get really, really wide. They make you declare your pressures. They make you declare relatively your coverages. And now we got a guy back there who can deal. She alluded to this in kind of like in Cincinnati as well, Joe Burrow. That's kind of the same structure they play. Kyle, I think, is the interesting one because all of this zone match, all of this stuff that's going on, his offense is relatively the same. And what I mean by that, it's still super play action heavy, right? There is an element of drop back but it's about the same as it was before, and so he has found a way to kind of keep his system and stress you in a way that these other systems have had to kind of evolve out of. And I think that's really interesting. And that is to me something that I want to go personally and go look at. It's like, what is he doing that allows him to dissect match coverage? And to be fair, he probably has the best, outside of Cincinnati, probably the best skill position group of the bunch, right? You got McCaffrey, you got Debo, you got Kittle. And so you can beat, because like I said, match coverage is going to play just like man. And to beat man coverage, you need dudes who can beat man coverage. And he's got them up there. So maybe that's part of it. But yeah, that to me is really interesting, is why has Kyle's offense stayed approximately the same? You can see the relation to 2012. You can see the relation to when he was in Cleveland. You can see the relation when he was in Atlanta, and everyone else has felt like we need to make these drastic changes to the structure.
Well, part of it, I think, is something that Matt shared with us, which is how he coaches the quarterback to read it. It's like, who cares if it's cover 6, cover 2, cover 3, cover 4? Right. We're going to look in this area of the field, and we're going to try to isolate one player. And if this player goes left, we throw right. If he goes right, we throw left. Or if we can get this particular matchup, we trust our one guy to win one-on-one in man coverage.
Yeah.
And if he doesn't, then, well, maybe you get to your second read. Maybe you just check it down. Like, they've got answers. And that goes to the thoroughness of Kyle, and kind of full circle to where we started, where Kyle always has an answer, and it's just a series of if-then statements. It's funny because anytime I think like this, I go back to middle school and computer programming. Like, that's how computer programs work on the most basic level. It's like, if this, then that; if that, then this, and then it's just like this series of if-then statements. If one is covered, then 2. If 2 is covered, then 3. If 3 is covered, then run. Or if 3 is covered, then check down. Or if 3 is covered, then JJ Watt is sitting on top of me. Yeah. Like, there's only a certain amount of outcomes, and it's planning and scheming those outcomes. And sometimes it's like, if 1 is covered this way, then 3. You skip 2 because 2 is also dead. Yeah. If 1 is covered another way, then 2, because that should be open. And so it's isolating those if-then statements without the care that traditionally you have for, if cover 3, then this. It's just, if this guy is here, then do that. And there were times that Matt said when he was on a couple weeks ago, like, I didn't care what the coverage was, and I still to this day don't know, but we scored a touchdown because I was able to identify the right area of space to look at.
Yeah, and I think you bring up another good point there, is like, Kyle, at least, in the last year when we watched the Commanders versus the 49ers, like, he did such a good job of ensuring certain if-then statements, if that makes sense. Like, he'd get in certain personnel groupings. He'd run the football. His sequence was really good. And I think the other thing, I kind of maybe answered my own question, is that he's definitely got the best defense of the group, right? So he can kind of lean into that run game a little bit more. It's not this offensive juggernaut. They're great offense. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, that offense is fantastic. But the margin for error for the offense is much bigger because the defense is much better. Maybe the best defense in football. So I think, kind of to your point, to regulate the if-then statements, with your personnel, with your sequencing, all that kind of stuff, and then trusting your defense. And like, he said something in the thing, it's like, where I ran the ball 45 times in a game. And I just knew that I didn't have to stress my quarterback. The offensive line could handle it. The run scheme was where it needed to be. And we won the game 21-17. And like, I was totally fine with that. And what's crazy is none of the other teams that we've talked about can do that. They can't shift it in a 4-wheel drive at any point and win a game that way, the way that his team can, which I think is another interesting way to construct the roster.
Right. How do you beat cover 3 match? You run all over it.
Yeah.
Like, Go ahead, match this.
Yeah,
And when you have
match this, that's right.
Match Trent Williams in space. Hey, your cute DB can read all this stuff and
Yeah.
pass off a route. What happens when Trent Williams is running into his face mask?
Yeah.
So there's that element. And by the way, he also manipulates space. The spatial Darwinism quote. He manipulates space by using McCaffrey in 1,100 different ways and Debo in 1,200 different ways. That also manipulates the space. And when you can simplify down as a defense what you have to prepare for based off situations, then it's a lot easier. And it's like, to go back to your example of the zone read earlier, right? That RPO type of situation. Okay, well, now we know if we know it's RPO or we know it's zone read, forget even the RPO.
Yeah.
We know it's zone read, then this tight end is going to come across and try to block me. I scrape over the top, bam, we're covered. Okay, cool. What happens if there's now an RPO element? Well, then we have this other player that drops off. Well, you don't know it's going to be RPO.
Yeah.
Like, you don't know that till the ball is snapped and the play is underway. So if you, based off time, score situation, this is why being in good down and distance is so important. You can come up with a solution for anything in a vacuum, but these plays don't exist in a vacuum. And
100%.
I think that's what makes Kyle so special as a play caller, and where these other guys have shined as well. Like, I think McDaniel does a good job of this. I think LaFleur's done a good job of this at times. Is you just don't know. I mean, Andy Reid and what he and Nagy and Bieniemy have done. Like, if you know that silly, pitch play is coming at the goal line where they score on it 7 times a year, if you know it's coming, it's not that hard to stop. The problem is you don't know it's coming.
And it looks like other stuff in your offense. It looks like from it, And
so the variety and kind of the window dressing and making it simple for your guys but harder for the others is the magic.
Yeah.
And just how they go about performing the magic trick, I think, is pretty fascinating. There's another element to this of like the human management. I think we can talk about that later in the week.
Yeah, we won't wait too long on that. Sorry, buddy.
But it's all good. This was all good. We just stayed in kind of the more schematic realm. But there's kind of the human management, which I think is also interesting after watching Quarterback on Netflix and watching specifically the relationship between Kevin O'Connell and Kirk Cousins. So we'll talk about that later in the week. Anything else to tack on to the end of this one before we get to Ross Tucker?
I think that's it. I mean, we could talk about this all day, you and I, but I think that was a good kind of summation of our thoughts.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Ross Tucker's next here on Take Command. Joining us now, Ross Tucker, national analyst for a bunch of different outlets. Westwood One specifically. I've been doing playoff games for them for years, analyst work for them for years. Ross, I know you have some exciting things coming down the pike, so make sure everyone's tuned into their local press releases to see where Ross is going to be more this upcoming NFL season. He also does the Eagles TV analyst work on their preseason. So Ross, very much appreciate your time. And I want to just dive right in with kind of this, this national perspective of the Commanders. I don't want to make you speak for literally every national analyst, but they have found themselves at the bottom of many, many rankings. I think a lot of that has to do with the quarterback situation here. And people just don't know what to make of Sam Howell, or it seems like those that have made up their minds say he's not going to be good enough. What do you make of Ron Rivera's decision to roll with Howell for the 2023 season?
Yeah, well, good to see you guys. Craig, good for having me. And I love that you got like a true blood and guts guy like Logan in the podcast game. That's amazing. Logan was when he played, one of maybe 7 tight ends that still blocked a little bit in the NFL, I think. So I always had an appreciation for Logan's game and the way he went about it because, man, way back, I always sound so old when I say this, but way back in the day, like, tight ends had to block. And actually, there was always one guy on every out of the 3 on every team that was like just straight blocker. Like, that's all he did. That has changed quite a bit. So love that Logan's in on the dark side now with the media. Yeah. Listen, I think the Commanders, in everybody's mind, are last in the division. And I think that's because they have more questions at the more important positions than the other teams do, right? The Eagles, kind of a known commodity. The Cowboys won 12 games last year. We also know that the Giants had a surprisingly good year last year. And they've even upgraded, getting that new center in John Michael Schmitz. Whereas the Commanders, quarterback question for sure. And by the way, question doesn't mean bad. Question just means unanswered. Sam Howell might be awesome. We don't know. I hope he is. It'd be more fun if he is. It'd be great. But then you combine Howell with a new OC, so you got a new system and a questionable offensive line, I would say at this point, with some of the guys they have in there. There's unknowns on the O-line. There's unknowns with Bieniemy calling plays. There's unknown with Sam Howell as a quarterback. That's just too much for people. I don't blame them. I mean, if the Commanders answer all those questions positively, can they be better than the Giants and maybe have a winning season? Sure. But in the NFL, most of the time, when you have three major questions like that, you don't answer all three of them in the affirmative.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. I think that's, like a really good perspective to bring in. Something I'd like to ask you, though, is you've seen kind of a precedent, at least in recent history, of offensive play callers coming to new systems. Obviously, Jacksonville with Patterson, New York with Daboll, and them elevating offenses in a way that's kind of unexpected. And I think, he's one of the best offensive minds in football, and having a guy that's had such a close proximity to him seems like a benefit. Do you think he can bring Sam along? Do you think he can insulate the offensive line? I kind of feel like if there's one factor that needs to be answered in the affirmative, it needs to be Eric Bieniemy and his ability to call plays and elevate this group. Do you think he can get that done?
Yeah, you know what? You're probably right, Logan. Like, out of the three questions, the one that does the most to help solve the other two. Although if Sam Howell's awesome, he can make Bieniemy and the O-line look good too, right? If Sam Howell turns out to be awesome. But no, the Bieniemy thing is interesting because, like, when you mentioned Daboll or Doug Peterson, my initial reaction was I watched both those guys call plays.
That's true.
And have a lot of success elsewhere, right? Like Peterson with the Eagles winning the Super Bowl with Nick Foles, Daboll in Buffalo with Josh Allen putting up crazy numbers. Whereas Bieniemy, which has always kind of been somewhat of a mystery, didn't really call the plays in Kansas City, right? Andy Reid gets the credit for that. So the thing I like about the Commanders, I think is so interesting, Bieniemy bet on himself in a major way, right? Like, let's put it this way. Bieniemy thinks he can do it. Bieniemy thinks he's the man, and he's gonna get the offensive line to play well, get Howell to play well. But I mean, first of all, there's a bunch of coaches that have left Andy Reid, and I'd say have mixed success.
It's a great
other
point.
places.
It's a great point.
Like a Matt Nagy, who had some success, right? Peterson obviously has had some ups and downs, but a lot of ups when he was in Philadelphia and a good run last year in Jacksonville. But guys, his quarterback was Patrick Mahomes. I mean, have you heard of him?
Yeah,
have you seen that guy play? I mean, I am confident that I could be at least a middle of the road offensive coordinator if Patrick Mahomes was my quarterback. So we'll see. It's going to be very different for Bieniemy. I mean, maybe he goes back to the Alex Smith playbook. And maybe Sam Howell can pull some of that stuff off, which I think would be interesting. But yeah, I think that you can make an argument. Although, you know what? I can make an argument for all of them. If the O-line ends up gelling and playing really well, man, that gives Sam Howell a much better chance. It makes it a lot easier on Bieniemy. As you know, and we all know, it's a symbiotic relationship between all three of these entities, and they're all very much tied together. Because they need each other to succeed.
So here's the thing that I think I get caught up on a bit, Ross, and where a lot of fans certainly get caught up that are far more emotionally invested than me, is this team was 8-1 last year. Like, people talk about them like they were a 4-win team. They won 8 games last year. And I guess the question I would ask,
with average quarterback play.
I would not go that far. That is being far too kind to the garbage quarterback play that was here last year. The question I would ask is, do you think this team is better? Because I think I look at it, and Logan and I have talked about this, so I can speak for him from our conversations, just relay what he says, not speak for him. But, like, we both think they're better. We think that Bieniemy can elevate significantly. We think that again, the quarterback play was poor for a lot of last year. And then defensively, I think that we have higher hopes for more consistency, what they were in the second half of last year, much more than they were in the first. And I think it's trying to square, okay, if they were 8-1 last year, we think they're better this year. Why does everyone think they're going to barely win 6 games. And I think that is where a lot of folks struggle. So I would simply ask you this: do you think they're better than last year in terms of what you project for them in 2023?
No, I think they're about the same.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that's fair.
And I mean, look, I called the Eagles game, Monday Night Football, when they beat the Eagles fair and square in Philly. I mean, that was unbelievable. And I don't know. I know you guys got rid of Scott Turner, and I'm sure there's reasons why, but I remember coming away extremely impressed with his game plan and how they played keep away in that game and won that football game. It was, I mean, until the Super Bowl was the only game Jalen Hurts lost as a starter last year, and it was against, and I thought Heineke had some solid games like that where in the fourth quarter he was a gamer, found a way for them to win. I think a lot of it has to do with the interior of the offensive line in particular. That interior trio, how well those guys are able to perform. We talked about how, obviously, because the thing is, and this must drive, Commanders fans crazy, you have a championship D-line. You have a championship receiving core, right? Maybe you could argue the whole skill position group. Like, they have, I think if you talk to people now, they'd probably say the hierarchy of positional value would be quarterback, O-line, D-line, maybe receiver, secondary. I mean, my point is the Commanders have a lot of players that other teams would want. They have a lot of really good players, but, O-line and quarterback might be the two most important, and those are still big, big question marks, which, by the way, leads me to a whole other question, which I'm still annoyed about, because you guys both sit here and you both say, average at best quarterback play. For the life of me, I don't understand why they didn't put Sam Howell in earlier. I mean, I guess Rivera, with the ownership stuff, was trying to make the playoffs to save his job. So when Wentz went bad, he put Heineke in. I can't remember if Wentz got hurt or went bad, whatever.
He got hurt. Yeah.
He got hurt. But anyway, it seemed to me like that would have been a real good time to get Hal a bunch of opportunities, a bunch of playing time last year. Or even like when they decided to put Wentz back in. Was that the Cleveland game?
Yeah.
That was
a
disaster.
Yeah. I mean, the simple answer is Wentz was terrible through and through. Yeah, he was good against Jacksonville in week 1. He was bad the rest of the games that he played. Heineke comes in because Sam is not ready yet. And because, Taylor had kind of earned that based off how he played the previous year. And he was good. That was the only good quarterback play they got, was for what, Logan, 4 or 5 weeks of like average, or in some games above average quarterback play. And by then, when he starts to go sideways in the Giants games, do you throw a rookie in there for his first starts in the most important games of your season? Or do you figure that Taylor's going to pull himself out of it or ultimately go back to Carson? I mean, I was screaming from the mountaintops, Carson, no, please just roll it with Taylor. Or if you want to pull the plug and throw a wild card in there and go with Sam. But I mean, the simple answer is Taylor played too well when he got that shot as the backup, and Sam hadn't gotten many reps, and that's the answer to the question.
I think it's really interesting that you have to think with the ownership change impending or whatever, you got to think that Rivera's on the hot seat, and that he knows that, and he knows the new owner is likely to want to bring in his own people. And maybe that's part of Rivera wanting to go with Sam Howell. Maybe he thinks like his shot is if he can win a bunch of games and show that he's got a good, young, inexpensive quarterback, such that the new owner will say, well, we don't want to mess with that. Because, I mean, I don't know. It's just remarkable to me that if this might be your last year as a head coach in the NFL, that you're going into it with a 5th-round pick with 1 start to his name.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's kind of an interesting thing, right? And I think a lot of people have put a lot of credence on that 1 start. The 1 start against Dallas late in the year, where he was supported a lot by special teams and a lot of, quite frankly, by the defense. And I don't know if you watched that game. Do you have any thoughts on, like, if you were the head coach, is that enough of a sample size to be like, I feel really good about Sam for 2023 for the Washington Commanders?
Thought he played well. I thought he looked the part. did not look like the moment was too big for him. And the fact that I was like, well, why didn't they put him in earlier? Says I thought he played pretty well, for sure. I guess the flip side of the counter would be, what were their other options this offseason?
Right.
Like
that's
what?
That's
I mean, they weren't going to get one of the top quarterbacks in the draft. So, and they did bring in sort of a security blanket in Brissett. And I got to tell you, if Brissett just plays for Washington the way he played last year in Cleveland, I think the Commanders could have a winning season for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, Brissett was pretty darn good last year, actually. Cleveland was bad because the defense was terrible. And when Watson came back, Watson wasn't very good. Brissett, they actually scored more points, and Brissett played better, I think, anybody anticipated.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, that's kind of what we've said is, if Sam Howell beats out Jacoby Brissett in camp, that means he's ready to be an NFL quarterback. Like, that's the bar. That's the barometer. And in some ways, that's what Taylor was last year as well. Like, I think Taylor's lower on that spectrum. But if you're better than Taylor Heineke, you're ready to play NFL quarterback. Sam was apparently not there last year, and I don't think he was given an honest chance to be. What's amazing is they thought Carson was, and despite the fact that he was throwing the ball on the ground all over training camp. But, they gave up a lot for him, and that's that. All right, Ross, let's wrap up with this. We got like 1 minute left. I want your favorite story that you can tell on a podcast from your time as a player in Washington. Your first stint at the start of your career or your last year of playing. Pick one, your favorite story.
Oh, geez, dude. I mean, I got about a million. The first one that jumps out to me was our first day of training camp in 2002. We had Marty Schottenheimer when I was a rookie in 2001. And whatever Marty said to us night before the training camp started, the hair on the back of my neck was standing up. I was ready to take my pen and just start stabbing people in the room. Like, I was so fired up. The next year, we have this ballyhooed coach, and he says, opening line, man, I went to 12 of these here training camps as a player. And, I can't remember one good thing I ever got out of it. I don't remember one thing but Mr. Snyder wants us to be here. So let's try to get something done tomorrow.
Oh,
that was the start of the season speech for the 2002 Washington Redskins. We all looked at each other like, but then we were killing everybody in the preseason games. So we're like, okay. Boy, I knew we were in trouble. I mean, I knew we were in trouble for a lot of different reasons, but yeah, I mean, I could give a bunch of other stories. You got to have me on again. I'll just do Spurrier and Schottenheimer stories.
That's
really,
Schottenheimer's
the man, so it'll be more just about that team. But yes, I'd be happy to tell Spurrier stories.
I would 1000% do an hour straight of Spurrier stories. 100% done. You let us know when we're there. Ross, this was great. Thanks for coming on, and we'll hopefully talk to you for Spurrier stories and other football analysis later this season.
Yeah, that'd be great. Great to see you guys. Great to talk with you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching this clip of Take Command. First, why don't you like it? It lets other people know that it was good, and then they should watch it too. And Logan, we have a new exclusive home for full episodes.
We do. 1067 The Fans YouTube page. Go check it out and please subscribe.
Yeah, do what Logan said.
Do it.
Very, very smart.